Hello and welcome back to Political Pulse, a podcast where we talk about what's important in the world of political affairs.
Today we invite Adil Cader to the podcast. Adil is a podcaster for his own highly esteemed podcast series, Talking Foreign Affairs. Adil is a member of the advisory board for the Asia Pacific Youth Dialogue, a member of the Pacific Forum as a Young Leaders Program member, former advisor for Australian youth representation to the United Nations, as well as an alumni to WA Harvard Kennedy School. Adil is an exceptionally talented member of the Australian Asian political community and has a plethora of experience with discussing political tensions.
Due to the Australian Asian nature of the politics you have a lot of experience in, today we are going to discuss aspects of the Pacific, a huge area of diplomacy that has been over conflict in the last decade. We'll also discuss AUKUS, a security agreement between Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States. We'll also get to discuss a bit about Australian foreign policy and its future. Firstly and foremostly, we should discuss a bit about you and your podcast, Adil.
Thank you, Xavier. Thank you, Nikki, for having me on the podcast. It's a really great studio here in Scotch. It's my first time here. I've seen some of the former guests both of you have hosted, and it's really commendable that in a short amount of time that you've been able to interview such high-level and esteemed guests. Talking Foreign Affairs started in late 2020. The idea was based on my university experience that there wasn't that much interaction with heads of state, former heads of state including. The idea about that came from not seeing that many heads of states during my times in the lectures, and I realized that students didn't really understand things beyond the theory. So the idea was, why don't I target former heads of state or former foreign ministers and get students to submitting questions. The reason why I started off targeting former is former heads of state are obviously much easier to get because they aren't as busy, but because they're not in their current role, things such as protocol, things such as topics they can't discuss was obviously more free. So that's how the idea came about. My first ever episode was with Gareth Evans, former Australian foreign minister, and from that we've been fortunate enough to grow our podcast to have around over 20 interviews. Some of my most notable guests include former heads of NASA, former heads of NATO, head of the World Bank. I'm about to host the 4th Australian Prime Minister on our show, and we really enjoy the component where listeners get to submit in questions, and people such as yourself who we've had on our show have really enjoyed the interactions with talking to former heads of state, because what you're going to realize is beyond the theory, there's a lot of politics involved in decision making. There's a lot of international politics involved. There's a lot of practicality with decisions being involved. There's a big connection between why decisions make certain decisions overseas and the impact that has here domestically, and that's something we would like to increase more upon in our program.
First, Adil, tell us about the origin story of your podcast, Talking Foreign Affairs. How did it start? How were you motivated? And how did you get your podcast to where it is today?
So as I mentioned previously, the motivation was that there weren't many programs putting young leaders such as yourself, so students and university students or high school students interested in political science and international relations, putting them directly in touch with the leaders who have made the decisions about the world we live in. So I came up with the idea and wanted to have this concept where I would ask a few questions but also have questions submitted in by listeners. So we started quite small and thinking we'd just do about 4 to 5 episodes, and as I mentioned, some of our first guests was Gareth Evans, and I had John Howard, former Prime Minister. I then had Rob Zellick, I believe it was, former World Bank President, Joseph Nye, who was a leading academic. I also did have Charles Bolden, who I really, really enjoyed as well, talking about his time in space diplomacy. So yeah, there was a lot of rejections. First of all, we sent out lots and lots of speaker invites. I'd send out maybe 20, 30 a day, especially being a new podcast. It was very difficult to get guests. But as the months grew, we just grew it and grew it and grew it. The more guests we had, the more easier it was to get new guests. And we also realized the importance of social media. So I was able to get help from MTI Consulting in a consultancy company in regards to growing our social media growth. That was through our Instagram page, Facebook page. We realized that that's very important. We realized the importance of weekly engagement, having quizzes, and we still say it's still early days. We're still hoping to grow it, hopefully to 100 episodes one day.
That's excellent, Adil. It's great to see that such a young, motivated podcaster can show hundreds, maybe even millions of students across Australia, Western Australia, maybe even across the globe, what success you can get with podcasting. Where would you like to see the podcast grow in the future?
Well, ideally, a lot of our episodes have just been collaborations here in Australia with different schools. We'd like to focus more on the Indo-Pacific, specifically Indonesia, working with universities there. We've approached a few other schools and universities in the Indo-Pacific. We'd like to get a few more foreign ministers or former heads of state from the Indo-Pacific, collaborate with universities there, and also have some more collaborations with schools here bilaterally, and really highlight the importance of some of Australia's key bilateral relationships with some of those Indo-Pacific partners. We'd really like to get, the ultimate goal would be where we can have a live audience one day and put high school students directly in touch with a former Australian Prime Minister, so they get to ask questions in regards to Australian diplomacy. And essentially we'd like more and more young students in high school about to go into university to really consider the importance of diplomacy. It's important to understand that you don't need to study IR to work in the Australian Foreign Service, and that DFAT does take a numerous amount of people from different backgrounds to work in the Foreign Service, and we really want to highlight the importance of why being a diplomat is such a rewarding role, and why so many people with different skill sets can go in that career path.
How can more young Australians or students gain more knowledge on foreign affairs and affairs that especially impact Australia?
Well, there's many different ways, and I'm glad you asked that question, because our podcast is actually right now hoping to do a career advice session on that. So the firstly is obviously reading. Now, there are many publications I would recommend. There was a podcast done by the late Alan Gingle, widely considered one of the greatest Australian diplomats ever, called Australia and the World. That actually helped me a lot when I was in university. Those are regular podcasts that explain sort of what's happening regularly in the field of Australian foreign affairs. There's another really, really good publication called in the Australia Outlook in the Past Week, I think it's called, but it's essentially a weekly publication by the Australian Institute of International Affairs, which explains some of the highlight in Australian foreign policy, what's the activities of the current Australian Foreign Minister, and it's only about a 5-minute read every week, which I would highly recommend. Some other podcasts that I would highly recommend are the Lowy Institute podcast by Michael Fullilove, and also the ASPI podcast. Lowy and ASPI are two of Australia's key foreign policy think tanks, and they do some really great work in highlighting Australia's conduct overseas. But as well, I think we're very fortunate now compared to, say, a few decades ago, where you could only read magazines and newspapers for general knowledge, that we have some really, really good information on Instagram. So some of the think tanks on Instagram do post some really great information. Council on Foreign Relations do some really great work in that regard. But also as well in regards to keeping in touch, I just think it's really important that young people do set aside, say, half an hour every week, turn off their social media, turn off everything else, and just dedicate it to find out what's happening in three things: what's happening in Australia, what's happening in the world, and how what's happening in the world implicates what's happening in Australia. Because once you get those three foundations sorted, you're really setting yourself well up for a career in diplomacy. And once it becomes a habit, it changes from something that's just a chore to something you enjoy doing on a daily or weekly basis.
Wow, well, Adil, that is hugely insightful into how we can cooperate and sort of get ourselves involved as students and other students in not only Australian foreign affairs, but also be able to do that, and how talking foreign affairs can even be a catalyst to move those sorts of actions between the students and industry experts.
Yeah.
So, further going into this, how can younger Australians get involved in this area? Particularly, what different avenues can they get involved in?
Well, that's a really good question, because a lot of young people, or even people early on in university or just starting their career, think, oh, to be an Australian diplomat I need to join the DFAT Foreign Service. And this is really touching into this new whole of government approach to foreign affairs. So to explain what whole of government is, before there used to be a thing where in order to work in foreign service you had to either work in DFAT in Australia or in the US, the State Department. But increasingly now, there are more departments in Australia that are involved in the foreign affairs space. So the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet has their own foreign affairs program. The Department of Defence has their own foreign affairs program. The Department of Education has their own foreign affairs lens. The angle I'm getting at is that there isn't just a one-size-fits-all. There is various other ways of getting involved. So some people join the foreign service straight up front. They do the DFAT grad program. Some work in the private sector, some work in NGOs, and join laterally. In terms of exact programs young people can join, there's obviously the government grad programs people can look at. But there's also NGO programs, so such as the UNICEF Youth Ambassador Program, which West Australia has contributed a lot to. There's NGOs like the Amnesty International, Oxfam, Plan, I believe it's called, and those NGOs give people really a good skill building when it comes to stakeholder management, policy analysis, etc. There's also the chance to work in state government programs or federal government programs. So really I would recommend anyone who is interested to get a career in foreign affairs, firstly go to the DFAT website and check out some of the roles that would be your ideal dream role, whether it's a representative to the UN or working in a policy advisory role. Look at the key skills they ask for. Typically those would be stakeholder management, policy analysis, communication skills, written skills. And think of yourself when you're joining your high school clubs or your university clubs, think of, okay, what activities can I do that can further enhance these skills? And then through that will kind of give you a really good path. And there also, I should emphasize this again, there isn't a one-size-fits-all. So you could join an NGO, you could join a youth dialogue program. The idea is that you're developing those skills, you're understanding Australia's role in the world, you're developing your policy analysis skills. And from there, really, it's up to you to sort of develop those roles, and there's different ways of getting involved.
Adil, you have spoken a lot about multi-track diplomacy. Could you explain more about this concept?
Sure. So the multi-track diplomacy is essentially a way looking beyond the traditional notion of diplomacy. The traditional notion of diplomacy is just this thing that foreign affairs is conducted between government to government. So for example, it's like saying that the relationship between Australia and the UK is only between Westminster and Canberra, that those two governments have a say in the way it works. However, the way that foreign affairs the way that multi-track diplomacy work, and this was actually coined by an academic called Joseph Montville, is saying that you have track 1 diplomacy, which is between government to government, but then you have track 2. So those are things like think tanks, like I mentioned earlier on, or high school exchanges, like what I believe Scotch College does with some other schools overseas, where I think, if I'm correct, a student here goes to an overseas school and vice versa. So people-to-people links. And the benefits of that is it's a more empowering nature and holistic way of viewing diplomacy, because connections between countries aren't just dictated by the top to top. Yes, the laws matter, the policies matter, but things like policy exchanges, high school exchanges, things like dialogue, so like the Asia Pacific Roundtable organized recently by the IISS in Malaysia, I believe it was, where you get think tanks from different countries coming and working on different issues. And the benefit is that when you have different voices in the room, not just the government voices, you've got more freedom. Think tanks sometimes can promote outside the box thinking, and so through that you see different policy perspectives. Sometimes it's important to have those school to school links, like what as I mentioned, the student exchange programs, because sometimes these students who are doing these exchange programs, they would then go on to be the different world leaders in the different programs that happen now. So if you look at historically some of Australia's former foreign ministers, they themselves are partnered through various student exchange youth groups. Another benefit of this is that as well, that it sort of understands that there's an interconnectedness of this wide web of diplomacy, in the sense that it's not just government to government, but there's different actors involved, everyone from the Prime Minister down to everyday students who can play a role in this, and there's various different NGOs and charities that young people can get involved with this if they're keen on playing a role in their part in Australia's diplomacy.
That's excellent, Adil, and I hope that even our viewers, if they're people studying or they're young Australians, they can look at that and be able to see all these resources and be able to engage themselves in DFAT or even in NGOs that are interested in making their education suitable for them to go into the world of diplomacy. Now, as we saw before, you've had lots of connections in the Asia Pacific, and you've got lots of skills in not only policy analysis but also looking at what the future might be with specifically Australian foreign policy, considering that Australia is going through a very rough time at the moment. So, considering this and considering your vast knowledge, we'd like to ask, what do you think some of the biggest challenges in Australian foreign policy are?
So, I mean, the biggest challenges, I would say, is, as always been for quite a while, is maintaining our alliance with the US versus our relationship with Asia, specifically China. So yeah, we face a big challenge in terms of balancing it between the major powers. AUKUS, which I'm sure we'll go into later on, does make that intricacy quite difficult. As you would remember, in 2020 there was some difficulties in the relationship with China. There were some exports that were severely damaged, and there were some restrictions placed by the Chinese government. However, that's recently changed, as you would have seen on the news, with coal slowly entering the market, copper being entered back into the market between the exports between Australia and China. However, there are still significant trade barriers economically, but there is hope that over the next few months, whether it be brought to the WTO, whether it's discussed bilaterally, that this would be all unwind. Some of the other challenges recently for Australia has been the lack of focus on diplomacy. There was some decrease in funding to DFAT over the past few budgets. However, in the recent budget there was more funding to DFAT, which some of the diplomats are actually quite happy about, because this gives more emphasis on Australia's ability to focus the relationship on diplomacy. As I mentioned before, diplomacy is this thing which is a wide connection of web, so there were some concerns initially that there was more of a focus on defense. Critics said that it was too hawkish, but those supporters said that given the current security climate, that there was a need for more of a focus on defense rather than diplomacy and DFAT. Balancing the relationship, I think, is going to be a very tricky thing. China right now is one of Australia's biggest trading partners, but as well there are issues in regards to human rights, environmental concern, and it's a very tricky thing for Australia in regards to voicing concerns over that versus maintaining trade relationships with China. One of the big focuses in recent times for Australia has been this notion of trade diversification. So instead of Australia being so reliant on China for trade, looking at other countries. So you'd have seen the passing of recently the Australia-India Economic Agreement. We're hoping that given India's vast markets, that this can help ease some pressure on Australia's reliance on Australians' reliance on China for trade. There was a recent passing of the Australia-UK Free Trade Agreement. UK is looking to go more global post-Brexit, so there is further hope from this. So while there are some concerns, there are also some opportunities to there are some opportunities to help mend these issues. And it'll be an interesting time with the new government in control and looking what the future holds for Australia.
Adil, you mentioned a bit earlier about AUKUS. What are your thoughts on it?
So AUKUS is a very interesting thing. When it was announced not too long ago, it did show that Australia was in a elite group of countries in regards to who the US trust. The US has been approached previously for submarines before. However, they've said no. So the fact that Australia did get approval is actually quite a big thing. One of the main concerns from this was obviously the rise of China, but that wasn't the only concern. Given this, there were other regional dynamics there were other regional dynamics that were listed as the reason for the wanting to get the submarines. One of the concerns from this has been that the submarines are not going to come until the late 20s, early 2040s. So in the case of a conflict between now and then, Australia isn't going to be that defense capability isn't going to be there for Australia. There were some concerns as well in the region. Some of the partners in the Indo-Pacific were not too happy with this. I believe just before the agreement, the then defense minister did meet with the defense minister of Indonesia, and there was some concern raised by Indonesia after this meeting that why wasn't the AUKUS agreement raised, why wasn't there much notice given. So avoiding further conflict with our current partners in the Indo-Pacific is going to be a major concern for us, and ensuring that this doesn't cause too much tension in the region also as well, and that this tension doesn't cause any further deterioration to our economic relationship would be an issue. But I think that if managed carefully, that there is great economic benefit from AUKUS. We've seen that there are going to be some opportunities for industry here in Western Australia, and I think if passed, and there's going to be further scholarship, there's going to be some academic exchange programs between Australia and the US. So if managed correctly and effectively, I think there are some great benefits from this announcement.
That is such a valuable point, considering where Australia currently stands and also what the world is currently going through, and also just digging further into what Australia's foreign policy is looking like at the moment, and considering that Australia is in rough terrain, as you also said before and earlier, was that Australia finds itself in a uniquely odd position where it has to choose between economic trade and sort of this prosperity with Asia and its Pacific partners versus this much larger economic trade potential with America. And also looking at sort of dichotomous decide on what Australia is to see and how this is such a big turning point in Australia's foreign policy history. What are some big changes you think we can see in the next decade considering Australia's foreign policy?
I think some of the biggest challenges is strategic autonomy. We go back historically. We were always tied with the UK. The UK decided our foreign policy changed until World War II, until John Curtin, then Prime Minister, gave his famous speech, and that signaled the change from dependency on the UK to the US. Now with AUKUS, that has raised some concerns about the strategic autonomy, that with the reliance on the submarines from the US, that's only going to increase it. I think one of the biggest changes we're going to see in regards to that is Australia will face a question in the coming decades to whether we want to remain reliant on other countries for our security, or whether we want to take this title of a burgeoning middle power more and look at how we can as a country become more autonomous. That is going to be challenging given our history, given as well that as an island country with so much to defend for our borders, that we might have to, it's just in our nature, we'd have to rely on the other countries. Something else I think that's going to change as well, and I think this was very evident in the passing of the Foreign Relations Bill. So for those of you that don't know, the Foreign Relations Bill was a bill that was passed a few years back. It essentially meant that any international agreement between a state government or city government, anything that wasn't the federal government, had to be approved. So for example, West Australia had a Asian engagement minister and an Asian engagement strategy. The Victorian government had a Belt and Road initiative. Essentially that now had to be approved by the federal government, and the reason is that globally we're seeing an increase of para-diplomacy. So para-diplomacy essentially means where a non-central government, whether it be a state government like Western Australia, or a city government, so say like the city of Melbourne or the city of Sydney. They conduct their own foreign affairs programs. This has always been a trend in Australian foreign policy, because if we go historically, prior to federation in 1901, our states, we were state governments, and our state governments had offices in London. Those offices have actually predated the High Commission that we have in the UK. So it's in a sense that each state government had its own sort of unique identity, and that's why even today when we look at federalism, that somewhere like Western Australia is seen as very unique to say somewhere as Victoria. When we look at our export markets in Western Australia to the export markets say somewhere like in Victoria and Tasmania, they are very different. So it would make sense to why state governments would not want to rely on the federal governments for international engagement. So that's why West Australia had its own international engagement plan, where they would focus on export markets that were important specifically for them. And increasingly across the world, this is becoming a thing. Perth has a sister city relationship with other cities in Asia, same with the state government. And West Australia was also looking at becoming a sister state relationship with Texas, given the historical similarities between both states. We see the same in the US, so cities such as New York, Austin in Texas have their own international engagement plan. We're seeing more and more uniqueness in cities and states in carving up their own identity in addition to the national identity that they bring. I think another key factor as well that will change is the increasing role of sports diplomacy, a big passion of mine. In 2015, DFAT released the 2030 Sports Diplomacy Program, and essentially what that is using sports as a tool to improve relationships with other countries. So the Australian Olympic Committee used this quite well with the Tokyo Olympics, using the Olympics as a way to build relationships with Japan. We're seeing this as well with the upcoming Women's World Cup, and we're seeing this as rugby as well with the Sports Pacific Partnership. If anyone's keen to know more about sports diplomacy, I'd encourage them to read about ping pong diplomacy, how the US used ping pong to thaw relationships with China back in 1971. It's a very intriguing topic. I think those of you who have seen the movie Forrest Gump would be able to relate to it. So yeah, those three things: power diplomacy, sports diplomacy, and strategic autonomy, I think are going to be some of the key changes upcoming in Australian foreign policy.
Thank you, Adil. That is hugely insightful, considering the autonomy of states versus the autonomy of the country, and how this modern form of politics is maybe even making these states break away from their country in foreign relations, and how they have an individual sort of right to be able to communicate with the world and other states.
It was a great opportunity to have you on the podcast today, Adil. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Will, for having me. It was a real pleasure, and I appreciate the work that your podcast is in educating young people on global issues.
Thank you.